And next, we're really privileged that we'll be hearing from another person who is Professor Helen Dickinson, one of Australia's leading disability researchers. Helen Dickinson is a Professor of Public Service Research at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, specialising in public services and cross-sector collaboration. With a long-standing research focus on disability policy and services, Helen is passionate about amplifying diverse voices in policy and research to ensure more inclusive and representative outcomes. Today, as an NDRP board member, Helen will guide us through how research can address the pressing question of where to from here. Helen, we're really pleased to have you here with us, and I'd like to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be invited to speak at this first NDRP Evidence to Action event. My pronouns are she, her, and I join you from the land of the Bunurong and would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. As a visual description, I'm a white woman in my mid-40s. I've got long, straight, brown, shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing a black shirt and I'm sat in front of a light grey background. So as Jane said, today my job is to think a bit about what we've heard in terms of research, what its role is in driving change, and what kinds of research we need if we're going to work towards eliminating restrictive practices. In some ways, this is a really difficult role, given we've had such an exceptional and wide-ranging event that's covered a lot of ground in relation to restrictive practices and also the broader systems and policies that prevent or enable their use. We've heard from a number of different voices and perspectives on how we can work towards eliminating restrictive practices within Australia. Although even with a 3-hour session like we've had today, I don't think we've managed to cover every issue or perspective, and the different debates around this topic will continue, and we can still continue to engage in that in the resources that Jane has outlined for us. But I think we've had some really clear messages relating to the role that research can play and the types of research that we need in this space. I think we quite clearly heard that although research has an important role in driving change and helping to realise the elimination of restrictive practices. And we heard from Minister Rishworth that she views research playing a really important role in informing laws, different reforms and services to better help people with disability. And she particularly spoke of restrictive practices as one example and reiterated the need for strong evidence base to support this work and to argue for reform and to underpin changes. Alistair reminded us that we don't have good data around the use of restrictive practices, and that the Royal Commission made specific recommendations about the need to have this data. And we need that not just to know whether restrictive practices are being used, but also if we're being successful in working towards eliminating these practices. So we need to check in on whether they're being used or not. And without high quality evidence, we won't know what kinds of contexts and mechanisms are helpful in eliminating restrictive practices and the kind of factors that enable their use. We heard from Linda Steele that restrictive practices are an under-investigated area within the academic literature, and that there are a number of important gaps. And while we know some of the cultural and systemic drivers of restrictive practices, there's a need to unpack these various elements and their interrelationships further. I think we also know that the more marginalised you are, the less likely you are to be reflected in research data. And often that's not a product of those marginalised groups, but of the ability of researchers to really think creatively and engage. Developing a strong evidence base could clearly outline the significant harms that restrictive practices do, could challenge restrictive practices and help to develop an evidence base about what the alternatives are. So it's not just enough to have high quality evidence to demonstrate that the restrictive practices are being used. We need evidence to show practice what alternatives there are to using these methods, and how individuals and organisations can work to achieve change and to eliminate those. I think the absence of research around restricted practices also speaks volumes in terms of whose voices are heard in research. A lot of the literature on restrictive practices isn't framed using an approach that centres the experiences and rights of people with disability. And there's a distinct lack of scholarly investigation of the experiences of those who are subject to these practices. So this emphasises the need for research that really centres the voices of people with disability, because without that, we can't get a full sense of the enablers and barriers to eliminating restrictive practices. This has a number of really important implications for research and how we go about doing that. So it's not just enough that we include people who experience restrictive practices as research subjects. As many of the speakers we've heard today have reminded us, it's really important where we conduct that research and what opportunities we give people with disability to contribute in a way that works for them. But in having people with disability as just research subjects, we don't fundamentally change how the power structures that perpetuate these practices, we don't disrupt those power structures. So as Catherine McAlpine really clearly articulated, we need people with disability to be involved in determining the research questions, how to collect data, supporting the interpretation of that data, and any recommendations or conclusions that research reaches. And it's not just those who experience restrictive practices who need to be engaged in these research processes. If we're going to do research that's meaningful and can promote systemic and cultural change, it needs to be undertaken collaboratively with a range of different partners across government, across service providers, across professional organisations. High quality research often does this from early on in the research process. So I think often when we think about using research evidence in policy and practice, it's often described as a process of translation. And that sort of seems to suggest that all you need to do in order to get findings put into practice is to translate them into a different language. But I think we know that if we want to get policymakers and practitioners to use evidence and to change how they do things, we need more than that. We need people to trust the source of evidence that it came from. We need them to trust the source in terms of the process that developed that data. And often it helps if there's some kind of buy-in to the agenda or the research process from early on. So we need good quality research that fills a number of the gaps identified today. And research also needs to include the voices of people with disability and needs to be collaborative with a range of different stakeholders if it's going to drive change. As a member of NDRP's research committee, I'm really excited that we have a funding round focused on the topic of safety, and really look forward to seeing a number of proposals that illustrate the elements of what our various speakers have talked about today as being needed in high quality research. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Helen, and particularly for those reflections and underscoring the power of research in driving transformation and highlighting the critical areas that we need to address and collaborate on. So your call to action reminds us that research is not just about knowledge, but about mobilising evidence for real-world change. We deeply appreciate your dedication to this work and your vision for a more inclusive and equitable future. As we come to the end of the event, I want to thank all of our speakers, panellists, and especially all of you for your engagement and contributions today. We've explored the evidence gaps, heard from advocates, and discussed what we need to do next. Before we close, I want to remind everyone that support is available if you need it. We will share a list of support services in the chat and follow up with an email that includes these resources. Please take care of yourselves and each other as you reflect on today's discussions. Thank you once again for joining us for this important conversation. I will give Clare the last word. Thank you, Clare.
Thanks, Jane. I think it's a little bit dangerous to be giving me the last word about anything, but thank you so much. And thank you for the great job that you've done in facilitating today's event. This is a subject that for our community carries a lot of emotion. And I know, that all of our speakers, including yourself, have been affected by this subject matter in some way. So I just wanted to personally thank you for stepping forward and taking on the facilitation today on what something that could be quite difficult to discuss. So I will not go on for too long, but I do want to say that an incredible thank you to everyone who has participated today, whether you have been attending and adding to the conversation through questions or the whiteboard or any other way that you have. I just want to say that we really value your input and engagement. I've taken piles and piles and piles of notes and learned lots of things that I didn't know, so I'm very grateful for that. And I'm really excited to have seen the thought-provoking ideas that are very, powerful ways that we can move forward on this one. So I am going to say that I'm incredibly honoured to have been part of this very first NDRP Evident to Action event, and just acknowledging everybody's great involvement and the willingness to push past the harm of the past and be part of these conversations. So I've got a couple of things that I do want to share with you as I conclude the event today. So firstly, I'm very, very excited to let everybody know that we have just yesterday, I believe, released the focus subject area for our very first NDRP research funding round, which is going to be around safety, following on from this great discussion. Our board has chosen this as a reflection of our commitment to addressing what we see as a very critical issue for people with disability, which is ensuring that they are safe and feel safe in all areas of our lives. The topic actually underscores our belief that safety is fundamental to achieving equity and inclusion of people with disability. And the board and I look forward to seeing some really innovative disability-led research that tackles the challenges and helps us to transform policy and practice. I also want to share that I'm really, really excited that part of the work that we will be funding sits under our capacity strengthening plan, which will include some funding for PhDs and early career scholarships for people with a disability. So I encourage everyone to visit our website, follow us on our socials, and stay connected with us, because we are putting quite literally our money where our mouth is and funding the capacity building of disabled researchers. Today is just the beginning of many important conversations. The NDRP is committed to ensuring that our research that we support informs real-world solutions that will improve the lives of people with disability. For us, mobilising evidence to action means that turning what we know into meaningful change, whether that's changing in policy, in practice, or in our everyday interactions. We also know that we are not standalone in this. Our work actually requires all of us to come together. That's researchers, advocates, policymakers, and community members to be relentless in our commitment to human rights and inclusion. So let's continue the conversation, continue to work together, make sure that we're prioritising the voices of people with disability and ensuring that all of the evidence that we gather actually drives action. No more talk, action, to leading to a safer, more inclusive society for all of us. So thank you. Thank you to all our speakers, to our interpreters, to our closed captioners, to the amazing NDRP staff who have frantically been working in the background when tech doesn't work, and supporting you in your questions and all of the ways that they have worked to get this together. And again, our speakers, thank you so much. Some of you I know quite well, and I'm just very appreciative that you put your hand up and said yes to this conversation. And to all of our audience, thank you for your contributions, for carving out 3 hours of your time at the end of what can only be described as a somewhat chaotic year for the disability community. And I'm saying that with kindness. So we appreciate that. And as Jane has said, please do take care of yourselves, and remember that support is there if you need it, because this is a difficult subject with a long history of trauma behind it, and we don't want to diminish its impact. So thank you, and we really look forward to seeing you again at future events and engaging with you in making a difference.